You're absolutely right. This year is compressed just because, of course, the midterm elections. I think both the House and the Senate leaders are going to be eager for their members to go back to their districts and states to campaign in advance of November. So our expectation is, in many ways, this Congress probably will likely come to kind of its end, near July. Now, of course, they'll be back in session in September to fund the government, hopefully fund the government once again for fiscal year 2027. But outside of that, we're not really expecting much legislation, beyond the August or the summer recess.
Libby, in one of your recent notes in your Washington Watch note, you have entitled, "Was 2025 peak Trump?" What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so in many ways, this is pretty consistent with other presidential cycles. The first year of an administration, particularly when the party in the White House controls both chambers of Congress, does see its sort of peak presidential power. Congress usually gives a wide berth to their president to sort of do what they want to do. The courts, in this case of Trump, have been sort of slow to catch up. So in 2025, like 2021 was for Biden, for President Biden, like in some ways 2009 was for President Obama, we do believe that 2025 was peak Trump in that it was sort of his apex of presidential power. 2026, and we've already seen some signs of this at the end of 2025 and the beginning of this year, we think the constraints of both the Congress and the courts will bind this president more. And again, this is less of something sort of specific to President Trump, and it's much more sort of indicative of the general political cycle where, members of Congress in particular start pivoting to their own survival and pivot to midterms. And as a result, start pushing back on their president, even when it's the president of their own party.
Is the Senate at risk? I mean, can the Democrats win the Senate from where you sit, Libby?
I think if you had asked me several months ago, I would have said absolutely not. Now, it's still not our base case. We still think that the GOP will control the Senate, but there are some primaries that are going to be quite important. Texas, in particular, on March 3rd. Who wins that on the Republican and Democratic side? I think we'll sort of tell whether that state is actually in play. But as you know, Tom, right now Republicans control the Senate by 4 seats. Not only would Democrats have to defend seats in Georgia and Michigan, those are seats that they have right now that, of course, Trump won in those states, but they would have to win 4 of 6, pretty reddish, pinkish states, including North Carolina and Maine, but also Ohio, Texas, Iowa, Alaska. Again, they would have to have a perfect night. I think to take back the House, they would have to have a so-so night. But in order to take back the Senate, they would have to have a perfect night.
So, Libby, you mentioned the courts here. I guess we're still waiting on the Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs. Are you surprised that it's taken this long? And does that tip the hand to maybe how they may vote here?
I'm gonna defer to the sort of the court experts, which I am not one of. I think according to those experts, though, this timing doesn't seem all that suspicious or all that much of a tell. I do think that that Roberts is likely trying to, if this verdict does go against the White House, probably trying to get as much of a majority on that opinion as possible. So that may justify the delay or what have you, or explain the delay. But I think the bottom line here for markets and what we're telling our clients is that even if the court does rule against the White House, and again, just based on the oral arguments, it looks like at least in some form or fashion they may, that this White House still has many other tools that Congress has given them. Maybe not IEPA, which is the law that's in jeopardy here, but Section 122, Section 301, sort of this number soup of provisions, they can still impose their tariff agenda.
Let me talk to Peter Navarro last week, and he was spirited, to say the least. We thank Mr. Dr. Navarro for his appearance, and I got him upset talking about how McKinley, late in his term before his tragic assassination, made what was called the Buffalo pivot, Are we in a slow motion Buffalo pivot right now as the president brings down tariffs?
Yeah, well, I think look, I think there's likely some sort of suggestion that, some folks in the White House do realize that, tariffs on things that the U.S. cannot produce, bananas and coffee, for instance, are, areas where maybe some tariff relief is necessary. There's, of course, some reports that there is, some tweaking of the steel and aluminum tariffs as well. Could we see a bit of a softening on tariffs? Sure, as sort of, again, realpolitik kind of sets in here in advance of the midterms. I think, though, however, Tom, to underestimate this president and his sincerity and conviction on tariffs is something the markets continue to do, and I think they continue to be on the wrong side of that.
There's some wisdom.
This is an ideology, of course, he's had for decades. The president feels a sense of urgency to administer his trade agenda. And again, even if there is some sort of political expediency that sets in, I think our view is that the markets and the economy are still going to have to digest, tariff policy and trade policy risk as long as this president's in the White House.
Libby, affordability has become a big issue in this cycle of economic discussion here, and particularly one of the areas is housing and the lack of affordability in housing. And I know that the House is expected to pass the Housing for the 21st Century Act. What is this act, and does it have a chance to become law? And how are our leaders trying to make housing more affordable?
Yeah, so it does, and it did, and the House and the Senate have now passed their own sort of respective bills. This will now go into what's called a conference committee, which, as you guys know, is sort of the fancy way of basically saying that the House and the Senate will kind of hammer out the differences in that legislation, and then we'll have to go pass a unified bill. I do think this will be signed into law. This does, I think, show you that both sides of the aisle are quite worried about this issue, just politically speaking. Of course, housing affordability continues to be one of the big laments among voters on both sides of the aisle. The reality is, however, that at the federal level, there are just, few levers that policymakers can really pull that have a meaningful impact on supply. One thing that we do think that the White House has done and probably will continue to do that could help is for the GSEs to continue to buy mortgages. They've been doing that over the last few months. That has brought down mortgage rates, at least incrementally. We continue to expect them to do more of that.
But the key thing I heard there, Libby, is from here to eternity, you don't see any more legislation coming out of the Senate or the House signed by the president?
No, and sorry, we do. I think the House will. I think that the president will sign this housing bill into law. But outside of that, and then again, a funding bill for fiscal year 2027, there just may not be very much. I think there's been some hope among market participants or some expectation that Congress may pass something in advance of the midterms that could boost the economy. We don't think that is the case. We don't think there will be this another reconciliation bill, no more tariff dividends or what have you, which Congress, of course, has to authorize. So, yeah, I think that's going to be, some cats and dogs, Tom, but nothing really significant from a market's perspective.
Libby Cantrill, thank you so much with Pimco.